contributed great and strong and clear ideas to this Manufacturing Jobs for America initiative. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. A quick update on where things stand in the Senate. 2 votes are coming up starting in a little less than 20 minutes from now. on final passage of the Defense Programs Bill, and also a vote on advancing the nomination of Alejandro Mayorkas to be Deputy Homeland Security Secretary. Reports say that the chamber will then go out for the night and be back in tomorrow morning for 6 roll call votes happening at 10 a.m. Eastern. And some details about that: those votes will be on a final passage of the Mayorkas nomination, a procedural vote and final passage on the John Koskinen nomination to head the IRS, a procedural vote and final passage on Brian Davis to be a district judge in Florida, and also a vote to advance Janet Yellen's nomination to head the Federal Reserve. A final passage on Janet Yellen's nomination will happen when the Senate returns after the holiday break on January 6th. And a little bit more about the defense policy bill that will get a vote here in a few minutes. It provides $625 billion for the Pentagon, including a 1% increase in military pay, and it also changes how the military will handle sexual assault cases.
The Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the bill that we're about to vote on is a good bill. It is the product of a extensive bipartisan, bicameral agreement between the Armed Services Committees of the Senate and the House of Representatives. We have passed a defense bill every year for the last 51 years, and this bill deserves to be the 52nd. Because like our previous bills, it does the right thing for our troops, their families, and our nation's security. It passed the House with a vote of 350 to 69, and it deserves an equally strong bipartisan vote in the Senate tonight. Now, yesterday I praised the members of our committee, and I also noted the amazing work of our staff, and I'm not going to repeat that. This bill is not a Christmas gift to our troops and their families. Authorizing funding for our troops, supporting our troops and their families is what we owe them. It's the least we can do, for they are the gift. They are the gift to this country, to this nation, and to all of its people. I would now ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the balance of my statement describing some of the many important provisions of this bill be included in the record at this point.
Without objection.
And I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
We just saw Senator Levin, who's chairman of the Armed Services Committee, a little bit about the defense bill that a vote's coming up in about 10 minutes from now. The Washington Post writes that about one part of the bill, about the cases of sexual assault and rape in the military, saying that the measure would end the statute of limitations for cases of sexual assault and rape, bar military commanders from overturning jury convictions in sexual assault and rape cases, make it a crime to retaliate against people who report such crimes, and mandate the dishonorable discharge or dismissal of anyone convicted of those crimes. The Pentagon estimates that 26,000 troops were assaulted or raped last year, but only about 3,300 filed reports with military police or prosecutors in that time period. A vote on final passage of that defense programs bill that includes those provisions about sexual assault in the military expected in about 10 minutes. A story in the Washington Post about the Senate tonight. Senate leaders reached a deal late Thursday to confirm 3 more of President Obama's nominees to top government positions, but delayed a vote until January to confirm the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. With the start of a 2-week recess fast approaching, the agreement appeared to ease more than a week of tensions between Democrats and Republicans over the confirmation of several picks to lead federal agencies. Senators plan to complete work late Thursday on the annual defense policy bill, that vote expected here in a couple minutes, and meet again on Friday morning to confirm Alejandro Mayorkas to serve as Deputy Secretary of the Homeland Security Department. And the story in the Washington Post goes on to say, Mayorkas, currently the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, has faced GOP opposition amid scrutiny by a DHS watchdog over allegations that he mismanaged visa programs for foreign investors.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Has all time expired?
It has.
I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the motion to concur with the amendment.
Is there objection? Without objection. The motion is withdrawn. The question is on the motion to concur. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr.
The Senate voting on the Defense Programs and Policy Bill for 2014. It includes about $527 billion for military bases and $81 billion for the war in Afghanistan. The bill addresses the issue of sexual assault, and under the legislation, assault cases stay within the chain of military command, and also prevents commanders from overturning guilty verdicts. And the bill prohibits the transfer of Guantanamo detainees to the U.S.
Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain,
As late as we are. You look happy.
Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch.
Will be confirmation of Mayorkas, cloture on Koskinen.
Mr. Roberts.
Confirmation on Koskinen.
Mr. Rockefeller.
Confirmation on Davis.
Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schott.
Aye.
We come back.
Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baucus, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Burr, Cardin, Casey, Coates, Cornyn, Fisher, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, King, Kirk, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, McConnell, Mikulski, Portman, Reed of Nevada, Rubio, Schatz, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Thank you. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Coburn, Lee, Paul, and Sanders. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Voted aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye.
I live on a rice farm.
Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Thank you, Gary. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Menendez? Aye. Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Beckidge? Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Flake? No. Mr. Bozeman? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Aye. Ms. Landrieu? Aye. Mr. Enzi? No. Mr. Barrasso? No. Read me the motion.
But how do I? Is there anyone wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 84, the nays are 15. The motion to concur in House Amendment to Senate Amendment H.R. 3304 is agreed to. Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Alejandro Nicolas Mayorkas of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, signed by 18 senators.
Under the previous order, the mandatory quorum call under Rule 22 is waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Alejandro Nicolas Mayorkas of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran. Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Baucus, aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the ayes are 55, the nays are 45. The motion is agreed to. Cloture having been invoked, the Senate will proceed to executive session and the clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Nicolas Mayorkas of the District of Columbia to be Deputy Secretary.
Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for debate only, with